Imagine walking into a place where the air itself feels heavy, where silence is not peaceful, but suffocating, where every corner seems to breathe with secrets the living should never hear. Funeral homes are meant to be places of mourning, of final goodbyes, of quiet respect. But what if I told you that some of these places hold more than just memories of the dead? What if I told you that the walls have witnessed things far darker than grief? Moments where the line between the living and the departed shatters? Tonight, you will step with me into the shadows of 4 terrifying stories that unfolded inside funeral homes. These are not tales of imagination. These are whispers collected from morticians, grieving families, and night workers who swore they saw what should not exist. These are the kinds of encounters that make you wonder, when the dead are laid to rest, do they really rest at all? Or do some linger, searching for something or someone? Let me take you to the first story. There was a small funeral home tucked away in a rural town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and where funerals were as much about community as they were about mourning. The mortician there, an older man named Henry, had worked the business for decades. He had grown used to the stillness of corpses, the creak of the building at night, even the occasional flicker of lights in the embalming room. But one night, something happened that Henry never forgot. It was late, long after the last family member had gone. A young man had been brought in earlier that day after a tragic car accident. His body was prepared and dressed, ready for the viewing the next morning. Henry locked the doors, dimmed the lights, and retreated to his small office in the back to complete paperwork. The silence of the funeral home was something he knew well, but on that night, it was broken. A faint sound echoed through the halls. At first, Henry thought it was the building settling, but then he heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They came from the direction of the viewing room. His hands froze on the pen, his breath caught in his throat. At this hour, no one should have been inside. Grabbing his flashlight, Henry made his way down the corridor. His shoes echoed against the polished floor, and with each step, the footsteps ahead seemed to retreat, pulling him deeper toward the viewing room. When he finally pushed the door open, the air was icy. His light fell across the coffin, sitting silently in the middle of the room. But the lid was ajar. Henry swore he had closed it earlier. His pulse quickened. He stepped closer, his light trembling in his hand. Slowly, he reached for the lid and slid it open. Inside lay the young man, his face pale, his body perfectly still. But Henry's eyes darted down to his hands. The position had changed. Before, Henry had folded them neatly over the chest. Now, they rested at the sides, fingers curled like they had been grasping for something. The mortician staggered back, nearly dropping his light. He told himself it was impossible, maybe a mistake, maybe his memory betraying him. He closed the coffin again, making sure this time it was shut tight. He even whispered a shaky prayer under his breath. Then he turned to leave. But before he reached the door, the coffin creaked. The lid shifted once more, slowly, as though something inside was pushing upward. Henry ran. He didn't stop until he reached his office, locking the door behind him, his heart pounding so violently he thought it would burst. The next morning, when the family came for the viewing, everything appeared normal. The young man's hands were folded again, his expression calm, the lid perfectly in place. But Henry never worked another night shift alone after that. And that was just the beginning. The second story comes from a young woman named Rebecca, who worked part-time at a funeral home during college. She had always been fascinated by the idea of helping people through grief, but she quickly learned that the night shifts carried their own horrors. One evening, Rebecca was tasked with cleaning the chapel after a late service. It was quiet, and she was humming to herself as she vacuumed the carpet. Then, out of nowhere, she felt it, the sensation of being watched. She turned off the vacuum, the silence pressing around her like a weight. That's when she noticed the figure. At the far end of the chapel, near the casket that had been left for the next morning's service, stood a man. He was tall, dressed in black, his face obscured in shadow. For a moment, Rebecca thought he must be a family member who had returned. "I'm sorry," she called out nervously. "The chapel is closed for the night." The man didn't move. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "Sir, do you need help?" Still nothing. The figure simply stood, unmoving, watching. Rebecca reached the front row of pews, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Completely gone. No footsteps, no sound of a door opening. Just empty space. Her stomach churned as she glanced at the coffin. The lid had been firmly closed when she started cleaning. Now it was cracked open an inch, just enough to reveal the pale curve of a face inside. Rebecca dropped the vacuum and ran from the chapel, refusing to return alone again. Stories like these spread quietly in whispers among funeral workers. They talk of shadows that move where no one walks, voices that echo in empty rooms, coffins that shift when no hands are near. Most brush them off as imagination, the tricks of exhaustion. But not everyone. Some insist that funeral homes are not just places for the dead. They are thresholds, and thresholds by their nature invite things to cross. And if you thought these stories were chilling, the next ones are far worse. Because not all spirits remain silent. Some demand to be seen, to be heard, and to remind the living that the grave does not always hold them. The storm outside had grown heavier, its rhythm against the windows merging with the pulse of something far less natural within the house. Elena stood motionless in the center of the room, her eyes drawn toward the darkened hallway that seemed to stretch longer than before. It was as if the architecture of the house itself shifted with every flicker of the lights, distorting space, pulling her deeper into something that was no longer her home. She could hear it now. Footsteps, faint, deliberate, pacing just beyond the edge of her vision. Every time she turned her head, the sound vanished, leaving her in silence thick enough to choke on. But the moment she tried to calm her breath, the steps would return, closer, heavier, resonating through the wooden floor like an echo that didn't belong to her reality. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Finally, a moment of relief. Maybe it was her brother. But when she pulled it out, the screen glowed with a notification she did not understand. A text message. No number, no contact, just a single word, repeated 3 times. "Look." Her fingers trembled, nearly dropping the device as the phone's flashlight turned on by itself, beaming straight into the hallway as if pointing the way. She didn't want to move forward, but her body disobeyed her mind. The air grew colder with each hesitant step she took, her breath turning into mist. The smell of damp wood and something metallic filled her nostrils, and soon she realized her bare feet were leaving faint impressions on the dusty floor, as though she were walking into a place untouched for decades. And then she saw it. The hallway ended in a door that she had never seen before. Its frame was warped, its wood swollen and rotten as if it had been there for centuries, sealed away from her knowledge. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the door itself, it was the sound coming from behind it. Not footsteps this time,
Voices.
but dozens of voices, whispering in unison, chanting words she couldn't understand. They overlapped and looped like broken recordings stuck on repeat. Elena's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She knew she should turn back, but something about those voices pulled at her very bones. And as she reached out, her hand hovering inches from the rusted doorknob, the whispers suddenly stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. Then, 3 knocks. Slow. Heavy. From the other side. Her phone buzzed again in her palm. A new message appeared. "Do not open." She stumbled back, terror clawing at her throat. Who was warning her? And why did they know exactly what she was about to do? She turned to run, but froze when she saw the reflection in the glass window at the end of the hall. It wasn't her. The figure staring back wore her face, but its smile stretched too wide, too sharp, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. And as the lights flickered once more, the reflection whispered words she couldn't hear, because this time, the voice wasn't trapped behind the glass. It was right behind her. The nun's eyes locked onto Maria, her voice trembling yet heavy with authority. "You should not be here. This place is not safe. Leave while you still can." Her words didn't sound like a threat, but rather a desperate plea. Maria froze, unable to move, as if the corridor itself had tightened around her, suffocating her options. But just as suddenly as the nun had appeared, she was gone. No footsteps, no trace, only the echo of her warning drifting down the hall. The silence afterward was suffocating. Maria staggered back into her room, slamming the door shut, her chest heaving as though she had run for miles. She sat on the bed, gripping her rosary, whispering half-formed prayers, trying to regain a sense of control. Yet the faint sound of chanting returned, threading through the walls, unmistakably closer. Sleep was impossible. The atmosphere thickened, and every corner of her room seemed alive with shadows. At some point, exhaustion weighed her down, and her eyes slipped closed. But what awaited her in sleep was worse than wakefulness. In her dream, she was kneeling at the altar of the convent's chapel. Candles lined the pews, yet none cast light. The statues of saints loomed taller, their stone eyes following her. From the altar emerged a procession of nuns, their faces covered with black veils, chanting in a language she could not recognize. Their voices were not of flesh, but hollow echoes reverberating against her skull. One nun stepped forward, lifting her veil. Maria gasped. It was the same nun who had warned her, but her face was now twisted, her eyes hollow cavities bleeding darkness. She reached out a skeletal hand, whispering, "You should not be here." Maria jolted awake with a strangled cry, sweat pouring down her temples. The dormitory was silent again, but her body trembled uncontrollably. Her instincts screamed to flee, yet her curiosity chained her to the mystery. The following day, she confided in Sister Elena, the youngest of the convent nuns. Elena was gentle, her voice warm, but as Maria recounted her experience, Elena's face drained of color. "You saw her," she said softly, "the one who walks the corridors." Maria pressed. "Who is she?" Elena hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering her voice to a fearful whisper. "A nun who broke her vows. They say she tried to invoke powers forbidden by God. When she was discovered, the Mother Superior condemned her, and she vanished. But her spirit never left." The story churned in Maria's mind, her terror entwined with fascination. If the apparition was real, what did she want from her? Why warn her instead of attacking? That night, determined to face the truth, Maria clutched a candle and crept into the corridor once more. Every step echoed like a drumbeat in her chest. The chanting began again, deeper this time, vibrating through her bones. Shadows slithered across the walls, coalescing into vague figures. The air turned frigid, her breath visible in the dark, and then she saw her. The ghostly nun stood at the end of the hallway, motionless, her eyes like voids in the pale shimmer of her face. The rosary in her hands rattled, though she made no sound. Slowly she lifted one arm and pointed, not at Maria, but at the heavy wooden door of the old library. The silence between the walls was no longer just an absence of sound. It had a texture, a weight, almost like a living thing pressing down on everyone trapped inside that monastery. Clara began to feel as though the darkness itself was whispering to her. At first, it was only in dreams, shadows bending into figures of nuns with hollow eyes. But soon, even while awake, she could swear she heard the distant murmur of prayers, not spoken by any living tongue. Father Rodrigo grew increasingly agitated. He had been tasked by the diocese to keep order, but every attempt to enforce discipline only deepened the sense of dread. He started carrying a small silver crucifix at all times, clutching it like a weapon. But the other priests began to notice his lips trembling, his words faltering mid-sermon, as if someone, or something, was whispering in his ear, drowning out his faith. The Mother Superior tried to reassure the younger sisters, telling them that fear was the devil's tool. But her voice, once so firm, had begun to crack. More than once she was found alone in the chapel at night, staring at the crucifix on the altar, her body frozen in silence, as though she were waiting for it to move. One night, during the vigil prayers, all the candles in the chapel went out at the same instant. The sisters screamed, their voices swallowed by the darkness, but then a single flame reignited on its own, illuminating the face of a statue. The statue's eyes, unmoving stone, appeared wet, as if they were crying real tears of blood. The next morning, Sister Clara woke with bruises on her arms and legs. She had no memory of what had happened, but the bruises formed the shape of fingers, as though something had gripped her tightly in the night. When she showed the others, half of them recoiled in fear, and the other half whispered that perhaps she had been chosen. Whispers began spreading among the younger nuns. Perhaps the monastery was not cursed, but blessed in a way too terrible to understand. That maybe God was not silent, but speaking in a voice they could no longer comprehend, one that twisted prayers into screams and sanctuaries into prisons. As the days dragged on, the line between the holy and the unholy blurred. Shadows stretched too long across the hallways. The bells rang at hours when no one had touched them, and the well in the courtyard was found filled not with water, but with something thicker, darker. Sister Clara, caught between fear and fascination, began writing in her journal every night. She described the voices she heard, the visions she saw, the shadows that seemed to follow her even in daylight. But one entry stood out. She wrote that the whispers were no longer outside her, but inside her, shaping her thoughts. She was beginning to believe that the silence of the monastery wasn't meant to be broken. It was meant to spread. And then, one night, she awoke to find the entire convent standing outside her cell, every sister in perfect silence, staring at her with eyes wide open, reflecting candlelight like mirrors. The silence of a strategist is not a mere absence of words. It is a shield, a weapon, and a stage. Machiavelli knew this better than anyone. He recognized that in politics, in courts, in business, the loudest voices were often the weakest minds, and the most powerful were those who could endure the tension of silence. Think of silence not as emptiness, but as pressure. Every moment you do not speak when others expect you to, the silence grows heavier. People project their own fears, doubts, and desires into that silence. And when they finally hear you speak, even a few words carry the weight of thunder. That is how silence becomes a multiplier of influence. But silence is not universal. There are types of silence, and each must be wielded like a blade. There is the silence of patience, where you wait for the right moment, forcing the other person to reveal themselves first. There is the silence of intimidation, where your stillness makes the other person question their every move. There is the silence of mystery, where your restraint makes you appear larger, more unknowable, and therefore more powerful. And then there is the silence of judgment, where by not speaking, you make others feel that they are standing trial under your gaze. Machiavelli knew, a prince who always speaks becomes predictable, but a prince who controls silence becomes unfathomable. Consider this. When an adversary grows frustrated by your silence, they often betray themselves. They talk too much. They explain too much. They expose motives they would otherwise keep hidden. Machiavelli understood that silence is not passive. It is an active strategy of extraction. The less you say, the more others will reveal. The less you reveal, the more others will fear. In silence, you do not lose. You gather power. You absorb information, and you create an aura that others cannot penetrate. And yet, silence is dangerous when misused. If you are silent at the wrong moment, you may appear weak. If you are silent without purpose, you may seem lost. Silence without control is confusion, but silence with purpose is mastery. The difference is intention. Every pause, every withheld word must have a reason. That is the art Machiavelli taught, not silence for silence's sake, but silence as a calculated move on the board of power. Now think about your own life. How many times have you spoken too soon and regretted it? How many times have you revealed your emotions before the right moment? How many times have your words given someone else the advantage? Imagine instead, what would happen if you held back? if you let others fill the space, if you allowed their own insecurities to spill out. Silence, then, is not just about discipline of the tongue. It is about discipline of the mind. It is about resisting the temptation to prove yourself in every moment. It is about knowing that true authority often comes not from speaking, but from withholding. Machiavelli knew this secret. The more others need your words, the more valuable those words become. When you are silent, people crave your opinion, your approval, your judgment. And when you finally decide to speak, they hang on every syllable. That is the alchemy of silence. It transforms ordinary speech into extraordinary influence. The final layer of this story is not just fear, not just mystery, but the lingering aftertaste of obsession. When people recall what they saw, they don't remember clear details, only fragments. The scraping sound that seemed to come from inside the walls, the faint shadow of a figure moving when no one else was in the room, the way mirrors began to distort their reflection at certain hours of the night. Each witness recalls it differently, as if the house itself twisted reality to confuse and isolate them. And yet, there is one thread that binds all their testimonies together, the sense that something intelligent was watching, not a wandering spirit, not a random haunting, but a presence that waited, studied, selected its moments with terrifying patience. It wasn't chaos, it was method. And that realization is far more unsettling than a ghostly scream in the dark. Because it means that if it was aware, then it also had intent, and intent implies purpose. The diaries discovered later, written by one of the last inhabitants, confirm this chilling suspicion. In scrawled handwriting, the person describes nights without sleep, hearing whispers calling their name, seeing the outline of someone standing by the bed yet vanishing when they turned on the light. But the most disturbing entry reads, "It knows I write about it. It lets me sleep only to keep me alive. Not because I matter, but because my fear does. Fear as nourishment." That was the conclusion. The entity didn't haunt to torment. It haunted to feed, to stretch the fragile human psyche until it broke, to pull every scream, every drop of dread, and consume it as sustenance. The realization is horrifying. Fear itself is not just a reaction. It is a currency, a resource for something else. And every person who stepped into that place unknowingly offered themselves as fuel. The house today stands empty, but not abandoned. Its windows stare outward like hollow eyes, and its silence feels heavier than any scream. Travelers who walk too close to its walls claim they feel drained, as if something invisible passes through them and takes a part of who they are. Even in daylight, the air feels thick, unnatural. The place has become more than just haunted ground. It has become a predator disguised as a building. And so, the story ends not with closure, but with a warning. If you ever stumble across a place that feels wrong in ways you can't explain, if the silence grows too heavy, if your reflection looks back at you with unfamiliar eyes, leave. Do not investigate. Do not test your bravery. Do not linger. Because fear is not always yours alone. Sometimes it belongs to something else. Sometimes it feeds something waiting just beyond the veil of your understanding. And when that happens, the true horror is not in what you see, but in knowing that it sees you back,